to On the Middle East, Al Monitor's podcast on the big and interesting stories in the region. My name is Amran Zaman, and today I'll be talking about Iran's newly elected president, Masoud Pezeshkian. The 70-year-old heart surgeon was the sole reformist candidate to take part in the elections that were called when Iran's former president, Ibrahim Raisi, died in a helicopter crash in May. Born to an Azeri father and a Kurdish mother, Pezeshkian is an unusual figure in many respects. He's expected to promote greater leniency towards women and ethnic minorities and to steer his country away from further escalation with the United States. Yet upon closer scrutiny, Pezeshkian's past record reveals a hawkish and sometimes rather dark side. Joining us to discuss his country's new president is Iranian academic Arash Azizi. Arash is the author of several recent books on Iran, including Shadow Commander, the acclaimed profile of the late IRGC commander Qasem Soleimani. Arash has also written several detailed essays on Pezeshkian. Hey, Arash, it's great to have you again.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be with you.
So, a very exciting time in Iran. You have this new president who's a reformist. Just when we thought that the reformists were over, he sort of, made it. And of course, the first question we all ask is it because he was allowed to? So let you answer that question.
Yeah, of course, the reformist political current in Iran, and let's be clear about something. This is a group that self-identify as reformist. Now, there's no, whatever the esoteric essential meaning of the word reformist is, this is what the group calls itself, because I've, heard a lot of word in the media. So is he a true reformist, genuine reformist? I don't know about that, but there's a reformist movement. He was their candidate, right? So it's capital R reformist we're talking about. And they introduced a candidate, and he was allowed to, yes. So the Guardian Council, the vetting body that decides who gets to run in the Iranian elections, a body that owes its ultimate loyalty to Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who has most of the power in Iran, they ultimately allowed reformists to run with their own candidate. And we can talk about the reasons that they did so. But this was really the first time, not just since the last few years, but it really was the first time since 2009, really. 2009 was the last time reformists were really allowed to run their own candidate. And that candidate, of course, won that candidate lost in a contested election in which, the candidate and reformist contested the declared results and the re-election of a conservative president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. But at any rate, yes. So the first big news, even before we had Pezeshkian's election as president, was the fact that the reformists were allowed to run with their own candidate.
Yeah, but I mean, the impression I had when that happened, and we discussed this with Vali Nasser in another podcast, was that the turnout was so pathetic that they felt to lend legitimacy to this process. They really needed to have more people come out and vote, and they understood that they needed somebody like Pezeshkian. But the question I'd put to Vali at the time wasn't this kind of a gamble? Because on the one hand, my understanding, and it's kind of limited, of Iran, was that the supreme leader wouldn't necessarily have wanted this guy to win. But maybe he did. So did he? Did he want to win?
Look, none of us, of course, are privy to the minds of Khamenei, and the workings of his office are also pretty opaque. We don't really know what happens there and what kind of inner workings there are. But I don't think he minds a Pezeshkian presidency too much. The reality is, I'll tell you this, Khamenei, for his entire life, he's tried to balance out between different regime factions. There are central contradictions to his political quest, if you will, that are not easily solvable. Those contradictions are that he wants Iran to be a powerful, popular, revolutionary, Islamist, anti-West republic. The problem with that is that a lot of these revolutionary ideals have very little support in the Iranian population and very little support in the Iranian establishment. And this is the part that, it's my claim, and a lot of people, I think, don't see that because we have a lot of simplistic takes in Iran. They don't see that, look, Iran you know, you can have whatever sort of DC bubble talk that you want, but we're talking about a country of 85 million with a very proud history. And a lot of people in this establishment are not very happy with this revolutionary Islamist sort of.
Can I just stop you there a minute? Because who is the establishment? Because you speak about, and we all know about the competing power factions, the Revolutionary Guards, and I mean, who is the establishment?
This is an excellent question. You know, we don't really actually even have a word for establishment in Persian. So, I mean, I like using this term.
Really?
Yeah,
Oh,
we don't really have a term. I mean, you know, we have similar term. The closest term is something like a ruling clique, you know, hayat hakeme, which I don't think is very accurate. So when I say Iranian establishment in English, what I mean is the military leaders, right, including that of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, IRGC. I'm talking about business leaders. This is like both the private sector, but the head of these massive sort of parastatal foundations. I'm talking about, you know, the movers and shakers of Iranian politics, those who are in charge of different machineries of the state, right? So this is a very large group. And look, it's just how, you know, it's just the way the cookie crumbles. You're never going to have all these people being revolutionary ideologues, especially because they already have a primary ideology, and that's that of Iran and Iranian nationalism of in a very broad term, right? So my point is that, look, if Iran has as many problems that it does today, these people are not going to be happy about it. I mean, they're going to know that, look, why do we have all these problems? Why is Iran a country with such wealth and social capital and history? Why is it today a country beleaguered with so many problems? Why is it worse in every single way than 20 years ago? And that's the thing. It's not just a comparison with an abstraction. Just 20 years ago, who can look you right in the eye and say Iran is doing today better than it was 20 years ago?
okay.
Very few
So
people.
they bring in this guy. I mean, the people did vote for him, of course. I mean, let's not forget that. Iran is very unique in that there is an electoral process, right? That, you know, once they decide who, you know, who's going to run, from there on, it does become pretty like competitive, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the competition is very limited to different factions of the regime, but the competition is genuine. Of course, as you noted yourself, the majority of people didn't vote in either the first round or the second round.
Right.
So this is, I mean, and the first round, a crushing 60% of people didn't vote. This means that they're not happy with the options that they are given. But in the second round, many more people voted, about 50% voted. And the reason that is that they wanted to stop Jalili. So look, if I give you a very
The
quick
hardline guy, the nasty guy.
ultra conservative, exactly. The ultra conservative, also fundamentalist is really better. His opponents, I think, accurately compared him as a cross between, you know, North Korea and the Afghanistan's Taliban, and really this
God.
is the kind of. And look, so when it comes, you know, if I want to sum it up in one sentence, I would say that actually, look, as incomprehensible as it might sound, sometimes the demand by Khamenei and demand of many people in Iran coincide, even though they hate Khamenei for many reasons. And I think in this short period they did. Because Khamenei's problem is this, right? Why does Khamenei not just give the state to people like Jalili and ultra fundamentalists, which I think in many ways resemble his ideas more? There's two basic reasons. First of all, is that they're really incompetent, right? I mean, you can't run a country of 85 million by nice slogans. And Khamenei understands that, right? This is the difference. Khamenei is an ideologue and a revolutionary, but he understands that you can't just run the country on revolutionary slogans. He wouldn't be able to stay in power for this long if he just wanted to do it like that. And he understood that, look, these guys are fundamentalists. They can't really run things. The possibility of a Trump presidency definitely unnerved him, I think. And he was like, these guys can't handle Iran in such a situation. And the second reason related to that is that it can be socially explosive. So if you put people like Jalili in charge, you know, Jalili had one of the leading people in his camp, Amir Hossein Sabati is an MP. He said that he wants to enforce the mandatory hijab in Iran in a manner that is akin to a war on drugs, without, and I quote, you know, harshly and without exception. People like this, I mean, what do you think is going to happen if people like this are in charge, right? Probably hundreds of people killed again, another social explosion, and you know.
And of course, Pezeshkian is at the opposite end of that. He was saying that he didn't want to enforce the hijab, so least of all in that kind of very draconian, brutal way.
Well, he never quite, he's
I
not
mean,
always
that's
clear. Yeah.
yeah,
So
that's just one of the things he said. But you know, so let's focus on him now. So he got elected. Um, are people in Iran excited, or are they kind of, you said they primarily voted against Jalili rather than for him, but now that he's won, are people excited?
I think excited. I think very few people are frankly excited, right? I mean, I think
Okay.
most people are not excited. Even people who are more positive are, I would say, very cautiously a little optimistic, right? Um, Most people are just, you know, they're sort of trying to see what's going to happen next. They're sort of waiting for this. And right now is the period in which Pezeshkian is going to pick his cabinet. It takes a lot to bring people back to the political process so that
Okay,
people
so
will
let
care
me
about
jump in
it.
and ask you, how much agency does he have to do that, in fact? Does he get to choose really his own cabinet? Or does
Yes,
Khamenei kind of whisper in his ear, hey, buddy, can you like make so and so foreign minister and so interior minister? Or he has like full freedom to pick his own team?
definitely not full freedom. Khamenei traditionally has, and even in the constitution, is pointed to, although not quite sort of directly, that Khamenei gets to have some sort of a veto over, let's say, intelligence minister, about some other ministers. And Khamenei is known to be a very hands-on guy. So if Pezeshkian picked a very problematic person from Khamenei's perspective, he would get a call and that would be a stop. Not to mention that all these ministers have to be approved in the cabinet, sorry, in the parliament, which is hardline dominated anyways. So the Iranian parliament, he was going to pick candidates that can pass the parliament, and some of them might not pass the parliament.
That's true. I'm glad you reminded us of that. But one person has been quite, at least for us who are looking at this from the outside, there's one guy who stands out in his entourage, and of course that's Zarif, Jawad Zarif, the former foreign minister, who's was at the sort of forefront of all those efforts with JCPOA and all that, right? So seen as somebody you can do business with, somebody who speaks fluent English. And as you've mentioned in these wonderful, excellent profiles you've done of Pezeshkian, he speaks English too, which is rare, right? Not many Iranian leaders do. So um, let's start off by sort of looking at diplomacy, foreign policy. What do you foresee? What kind of changes, if any, bearing in mind, of course, that the supreme leader has final say and more weight than anyone else in Iran?
So the Supreme Leader does have the final say, but the Supreme Leader clearly, Khamenei, he also wants some change. And I think the reason he wants some change is that he saw that Iran was becoming dangerously isolated internationally. Let's not forget that even under hardline President Raisi, Iran was negotiating with the US secretly. Iran is negotiating with the US as you and I speak now. In Oman, there are on and off meetings here and there. They leak time to time. Obviously, they're secret, so we don't know all that is going on. But Iran has never stopped negotiating with the US. And it won't stop negotiating with the US under Trump either. Iran has never stopped actually negotiating with the US since 1979, funnily enough. There's no US president who has not had some sort of a talk with Iran at some point. And some of the probably the most extensive collaborations ever happened under Reagan and George W. Bush. So, they don't really, it doesn't really fit sort of public personas. But so what changed? I think we're going to see an attempt by Pezeshkian's administration to calm down Iran's international relations and to try to approach the US for some sort of deal. Of course, what kind of a deal and whether there would be a receptive party on the other hand. This is, of course, a US election year.
Yeah.
That's the question. There are many people who are pushing for Iran to try to do something before November. It's extremely volatile situation in the US. As you know, we're
Oh,
talking about Biden. Not only he's not sure he's going to be, not only he is not sure he's going to be president in November, he's not even sure if he's going to be the nominee now, right? Because of all the countries around him. So it will be difficult, but nevertheless, there is a professional diplomatic corps on both sides. So it's also possible that the negotiations will go on. But this deal would effectively be a mini repeat of JCPOA, the Iran deal of 2015. The attempt is for Iran to probably walk back on some of its nuclear actions in exchange for some sanctions relief. Although this will be contentious on many rounds, because there are many people in Iran who are now thinking Iran shouldn't walk back on its nuclear actions, that it has no reason to, that it should continue to have a very advanced nuclear program and perhaps deal with the sanctions. And yeah, so I mean we can talk about some of the more details, but there's definitely going to be a change in direction and orientation.
but I mean,
Because
course,
be a big
who
punishment.
sits in the White House will be a major factor, and I don't see how, given the war in Gaza and Ukraine and all of the what's happening inside the United States, how the administration would have the kind of bandwidth that would allow it to, short of a real, desire on the part of the regime, like total commitment to making this happen and being flexible and ready. I don't see how you could have a deal in place, frankly, before the US election, barring some kind of, as I said, major push on the Iranian side. But setting that aside, do we expect any shift in Iran's relationships inside the Middle East? Can we foresee, especially given, the volatility, the unpredictability of a Trump administration? Do you foresee an even greater effort to maybe fix ties with Saudi Arabia, for example? Is that something that Pezeshkian spends time thinking about, or the people around him, like Zarif, think about?
Definitely. So definitely. I should say, for example, by the way, that Zarif had a very important role in the campaign. Very interestingly enough, he's basically ruled out a role for himself in the cabinet. It was very clear he was never going to be foreign minister again, but there was an idea that maybe he will be vice president. But it looks like he's ruling himself out. It's a very interesting. The cabinet formation right now is very interesting. It's one of the most transparent compared to previous rounds. There are working groups formed of, including private sector, including, the reformist front, but also including experts in different fields. So there's a working group of like 30, 40 people for each ministry trying to come up with a list of names. It's a very contentious period, as you can imagine. Reformists are also coming back from political wilderness after like 2 decades. But let me just make a prediction here, right here on your podcast, that I think the next Iranian cabinet will be probably the youngest in a very long time, and I think you will have 2 or maybe even 3 women as cabinet ministers. You have to remember, Iran has had only one female cabinet minister since 1979. So this will be an important event,
And
I think.
remind us who that was again. I thought Rafsanjani's daughter was a member of parliament, but she was never a minister, was she?
No, she was never a minister. Cabinet minister, we've only had one, and that was actually under Ahmadinejad. That was Marzieh Dastjerdi. She was a health minister under
Okay.
Ahmadinejad. But we've had the heads of some, let's say, sub-cabinet presidential appointments. So the head of the environmental organization has often been Masoud Pezeshkian under both Rouhani and Khatami, and some others. And there's a women's department whose head is appointed by the president. Sometimes it's translated as some sort of vice president for women affairs. That's always a woman. So I mean, that
To
doesn't
get
count.
back to my point about the Middle East, because our audience is very Middle East focused, do you
Yes.
see any kind of what's your prediction for how Iran under Pezeshkian will navigate its relationships with the Gulf powers, and also how will things play out in Syria? That's something I'd really like to talk to you about.
For
Very
sure.
important.
So for starting with GCC, there's definitely going to be a push. I said introduction to say Zarif and others are not going to serve themselves, but people like them. Arash is likely going to be foreign minister. They're certainly going to invest in relationship with GCC, Saudi Arabia and others. This was even a priority of Raisi administration. Let's not forget, Raisi mentioned that in his inaugural press conference in 2021, and he did, after all, was able to reestablish ties with Saudi Arabia. Now Bahrain is going to be the next. Egypt is going to be the next. So Iran is very much trying to establish ties in the region. Of course, there are contradictions, because at the same time it wants to support these anti-Israel militias. These militias are no friend of stability in this region. But I think it's likely that we're going to get a ceasefire in Gaza in the next little while. I mean, I'm optimistic
You're
there, and I think.
optimistic.
Yes, I think that we're going to have some sort of a ceasefire, and to end, at least a reprieve to the terrible carnage that's going on in Gaza right now. And I think as a result of that, that Iran will not be an upsetting actor, right? It's not necessarily going to want to upset that, like push,
So
have
you
any.
don't think there's going to be a war between Hezbollah and Israel?
I think it's definitely a possibility, and I think it's something that Iran would want to avoid. But I think it's definitely possible for that. But I think if we have a ceasefire in Gaza, the chances of that war becomes lower as well. And I think Iran
Yeah.
wants to avoid it for its own self-interest and for Hezbollah's
But
self-interest.
we have a Netanyahu problem, so it's all like everything
Definitely,
is up in the air.
definitely, yeah, definitely.
But
There is
do
that
you,
danger
I
there.
mean, let me put it to you in very simple terms. Do you think the Saudis are happy that somebody like Pezeshkian won rather than Jalili? Does it fit their agenda? Because, there's this kind of like effort by some people to portray Pezeshkian as just, more of the same. Let's not be fooled. All of these guys are, radical,
They're not the same.
dangerous.
Look,
And we should decapitate this regime. And you're familiar with that narrative, and people who almost are like alarmed that anyone would think, oh, things might get better. Where does Saudi stand on this? Would Saudi like to see the Americans decapitate the regime, or are they happy
what
to
does
see someone
decapitate
like
mean?
Pezeshkian and de-escalation and, maybe striking some kind of modus vivendi with Iran, where everybody can actually maybe even benefit in some way from, good relations with one another?
I think Saudis want calm in the region, and I think I think they're happy with the Pezeshkian presidency, much better than Jalili. It's a fact that Pezeshkian several times during the campaign mentioned and attacked those who had attacked the Saudi embassy in Iran and led to the disruption of ties with Iran and Saudi Arabia in 2016. Many of them were close to Jalili, and this was one of the central teams. I would say if like 2 or 3 teams of foreign policy for Pezeshkian, one of them was this, so they're happy. If you look at the Saudi ambassador to Tehran, he just gave an interview in Iran, and you can see that he was sort of talking rather admirably of, he said it's the last few months prove that Iran is a country of institutions. The fact that the president died in that crash and there was an election. And look, this whole matter of I would love the Islamic Republic to be overthrown and be replaced by a democracy if that was a possibility, and I think it could be a possibility someday. I'm not sure that's like exactly what every country in the region, most of whom are not democratic. I'm not sure they will be necessarily very excited about that, frankly.
No.
But also, the idea, can I just say something? We can all have different analysis and different takes and different politics, but we're not entitled to our own facts. If you think that all factions of the Islamic Republic are the same, that it doesn't matter, whether Rouhani is in charge or whether Jalili is in charge, and a few things get sort of mixed up. I just don't see this as frankly as viable takes on the situation. I think it's just putting your own desires ahead of others. It's very clear that there are important clashes in the Iranian establishment, in the Islamic Republic establishment over the future of this country. After all, you don't need to take my words for it. I have evidence. Look, a former head of the Foreign Policy Committee of the parliament, of the Iranian parliament, not of some group out there, the foreign head of the Foreign Policy Committee of the Iranian parliament advocates against Iran's support for Russia, advocates against Iran's support for Hamas and Hezbollah. All these articles that I've written in the Atlantic, I invite people to read. How many times have I quoted former leading diplomats who criticize tenets of Iran's policy, whether against Israel or against Ukraine and its military aid to Russia in the invasion. So there are important differences. And where are the
Are you
differences?
talking about former Iranian diplomats?
That's right. And not former as in like 70 years ago diplomats. Diplomats who are 2 years ago resigned. Of course, Pezeshkian is not going to have a press conference and, declare that he's going to fight Hezbollah. But there are people.
Well, he, quite to the opposite, he declared his support for Hezbollah, right? Just recently, yeah.
Yeah, but that's how it works, right? Why do you think, by the way, why should Pezeshkian come to power and write a letter to Hassan Nasrallah to say, look, don't worry, we support you? Because he knows they're gonna worry, right? You do this kind of thing when you understand that there might be a worry on the other hand. And look, it's a delicate situation. Khamenei holds the ultimate power in the region. The embassies of Iran in the region are not even run by the foreign ministry. They're run by the IRGC, this militia. But there are fundamental differences over how should Iran look at, in its region. And I'll tell you this, for example, there is definitely a faction of the Iranian establishment that is effectively happy with the two-state solution. Now, they're not going to always say that.
You mean a two-state solution for Palestine, Israel, right?
Yes, not Cyprus.
Not Cyprus.
We'll talk about that later.
But so it's everything is much more nuanced. But let's shift to Syria, where there's this effort on the part of Turkey to make nice with Assad, sounding almost desperate, I'd say. And you read some Turkish commentators who claim that Iran would be unhappy if Assad and Turkey reconciled, because they'd be concerned that that would somehow translate into less influence for them over that regime. And that's certainly something that, well, everybody, the Gulf people, Gulfies want. And that Russia would actually be much happier with. So well, where does Iran stand on Turkey-Assad reconciliation?
I think they've got
And
one
does
way.
Pezeshkian have a view that we're aware of on that?
Pezeshkian wouldn't know a lot about this personally. Zarif would, and Arakchi would, and they're gonna come
Who's
to.
that? Who's Arakchi?
Arakchi is very likely to be the next foreign minister. He used to.
Okay, who is he? Just to remind our audience.
So he used to be deputy foreign minister under Zarif before. He is both a veteran diplomat and he has a distinction of both being very sort of internationally respected, but also he has sort of a background in the sort of within the IRGC youth and Basij and this types. He's sort of seen as a respected guy, but he's also very internationally respected. He was effectively Iran's chief nuclear negotiator, even though Zarif was the chief nuclear negotiator.
Right. And so what would his position on this be, for example? What would he be happy to see Turkey and Assad shake
I
hands?
think I think anybody who is in Iran is going to be worried about the fact that Assad has basically expanded his links with parties other than Iran. He's done that with GCC. He's done that with Turkey already. He's effectively done that with Turkey, even though it hasn't resulted in an actual sort of agreement yet. Iran also has links. Actually, historically, Iran has links to YPG, frankly, and the SDF, the sort of Kurdish-led administration of eastern Syria. Iran will also even think about how it can play with that. And I say play because I mean it's not sort of a straight out alliance. So look, there are worries there, and we've already seen for a long time we've seen the results of these cracks. For example, one fact that very few people talk about is how Assad kicked out the Houthis out of Syria. Like the Assad regime had recognized the Houthi movement in Yemen as the government of Yemen for a little while, but it kicked them out as part of its reconciliation with UAE and GCC countries, and its reabsorption to the Arab League. It kicked the Houthis out and effectively recognizes the Yemeni government now, the international Yemeni government.
So here's the million-dollar question. On the one hand, we see how all of this doesn't align with Iran's interests, this rapprochement between Assad, the Gulf, Turkey, and maybe even at some point the Europeans. Who knows? Anything is possible, especially if Trump comes to power. But then you have this sense in Iran that we really need to de-escalate with the West. We need to stabilize the relationship. And isn't Syria one of the places where you can show good faith to the West?
That's sort of what I was getting to. I think what we're going to have.
Yeah.
I think, it's very unfortunate that Syria, which had a wonderful democratic movement, is effectively now a playground for quasi-colonial actors in the region. And frankly, this is how it is. It's Iran, Russia, and Turkey are these big states which are going to play over Syria, just like Germany and France and Britain once sat down in diplomatic tables in late 19th century and decided the fate of countries. And that's frankly the kind of course, Syria also has a government in Assad that is part of this, but it's a very weak government, so it's reliant on this. So I think if you look at Astana process that started under Rouhani and Zarif had a big role in, and this was Iran, Russia, and Turkey meeting regularly over Syria, meeting in Kazakhstan, I think you're going to have similar approaches there. Everybody knows nobody wants to restart the civil war in Syria or doing something of that kind. I think they're going to have, they're going to come to some sort of agreement. The really thorny question is what happens, for example, with the Northeastern administration in Syria. That's a very
You mean the Kurds, but that doesn't necessarily come down to Iranian policy, does it? I mean, the Iranians
well,
will
it's like
be
the
the
future
final
Syria.
arbiters of that.
They're not well. They have a role. I mean, it's a question of future of Syria, right? The question is, if Turkey wants.
I mean, part of the reason Turkey wants to make peace with Assad is because it's fearful that if it doesn't, then Iran, the regime, they team up and they do business with the YPG in a way that's really threatening to Turkey's national security interests, especially in a scenario where the Americans are gone, which is
Yeah,
why the Turks, want to sort of make this deal with Assad while the Americans are still around.
we should never forget Iran and Turkey for decades on have never stopped having a very close relationship. Now it's been a relationship when they're unhappy sometimes. Iran has sometimes given a bit of a help to PKK. Obviously, Turkey would not be happy with that, but it's never been like a full-on alliance like Iran had, for example, with Iraqi Kurds at points. It's because Iran and Turkey have had very, hands-in security ties. And really, this is part of what I study, and it's kind of amazing if you look at it throughout the decades. If you look from the 1930s to now, the Iran-Turkey relationship have never really grown sour, really. It has never got to a stage where both sides have too much to lose. It's a very important border. They're very important economic partners.
Well,
So
right. So, I mean, the
so they're
question.
gonna agree on Syria. So I don't think basically I think they're gonna shout at each other and all that, but I think they're gonna find a way to agree on Syria.
No,
And
I
frankly,
think a very, I'm sorry to interrupt. I think a very interesting development is that Iraq is trying to play that role of bringing Turkey and Assad together. And of course, we all know that Iran has a lot of influence over Iraq and its prime minister. So
though
ostensibly,
that's changing, as you know, that's also changing, which is
okay,
interesting.
tell me, how is that changing?
Well, it appears that Mohammad Shia al-Sudani, the prime minister of Iraq, is kind of moving away from his Iran-backed partners, and this is domestic Iraqi politics. But I think we're going to see some very interesting news about that in the next, little while. It appears that let's say, the non-Iran-backed Shia element in Iraq is activated, which is all again. It also means that Pezeshkian and the new administration in Iran and people who are in power in Iran now, they also have an opportunity to do things differently. Maybe they can have a different sort of agreement with Iraq. Look, can I just say something that's very important? When Rouhani was president from 2013 to 2021, one important thing about him was that he was really opposed by IRGC at every count. The kind of crazy thing this time around is that there looks to be some sort of an agreement between Pezeshkian and IRGC. Now, it could break, but so far there's a bit of an agreement. So it's not like IRGC is pro-Jalili. I want to be clear about that. This is not clear to be the case. And the other thing is Khamenei is 85. He's on his way out, and everyone knows he's on his way out. So people are already really battling for the shape of the future of Iran. And they'll have that in mind as they build, as they sort of regulate their relationships across the region. And it's not going to be an easy road. Iran has invested for so long on these groups that are all these militias that are really bent on a revolutionary destabilizing role in Lebanon, in Palestine, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, right? So the question of how to this is very different than compared to Saudis. When Saudis say they want a stability, it's clear that the stability favors them and their interest, and it always has, frankly, at least for a very long time. Same with Turkey. Turkey is clear what its sort of intentions are, national security interests, how it regards the Kurdish movement in Syria. These are very clear. But Iran is not always so clear, and it's not clear what is it gonna do. And this is, look, there has long been a battle, Amberin, over the soul of Iran's foreign policy, and it looked settled. This battle looked to have been settled on the Khamenei for a while. That no, Iran was effectively a platform for supporting this Islamist revolutionary causes, but it's not settled anymore, I think. And I think there is serious contestation over that and over what Iran's role can be, and that people like Pezeshkian, Rouhani, Zarif, who are now going to have a more important role in power, are going to push for Iran to be a more normal country, likely. Now, that's not going to be an immediate change in policy, but I think ultimately it will be a change in
Well,
orientation.
I mean, tell me a little bit about his Kurdish and Azeri roots. His father is Azeri or was, and his mom Kurdish. He speaks both languages. Will that have any bearing on his policies domestically? Will we see Iran being kinder to its Sunni Kurds, for example, less Sunni Kurds, executed every day? Maybe a little relaxing of the sort of, cultural and political life. in the Kurdish areas, or and
I
ditto
think so.
the
I think we
Azeris?
will see some. Look, one has to be cautious in making sort of predictions. The reality is, as you mentioned, Sunni Kurds are disproportionately executed by this regime, and Pezeshkian didn't even claim to be able to change that kind of thing because it's controlled by the judiciary, which is not controlled by him at all. He has little say there. But my prediction is that I think, yes, he will try, he will take some measures to relax the repression against the Sunni minorities, both in the southeast and it is the Baluch in the southeast and Kurds in the west of Iran. I think he'll appoint, he promised to appoint more Sunni or any, Iran has, I don't think Iran has had a single Sunni governor general, don't quote me on it, but provincial governors. I think Iran has either not had or very rarely had provincial governors who are Sunni, and he basically promised to change that. So I think we're going to see some changes there. In all the working groups that for cabinet ministers that I talked about, in all of them right now, there is what they call, is actually funny because it's very woke if you look at the Western sort of parlance, but there's a minorities group on every working group, and these minorities includes both disabled people, ethnic minorities, religious minorities.
Since
So
when?
anybody who this is in the working groups for the formation of the cabinet.
Oh, you mean now? So this is
Yeah,
something new.
yeah. This is something that Pezeshkian did right now in the working group side.
Oh,
Yeah, so
wow.
yeah, so he's sensitive to those matters. And look, he received a lot of abuse by his opponents, frankly, both anti-regime opponents and the hardliner opponents in Iran, who, frankly, in a somewhat racist manner, if I'm frank, accused him of being a pan-Turkist or being not a good enough as an Iranian, even though he was a soldier he was a soldier and a medic in the war with Iraq in the 1980s. He's been an Iranian MP for a very long time. He's good patriotic credentials, if you will. But he was accused of that. But of course, he's a regionalist. He did say a while back that he's very proud to be born a Turk. He thanks God that he's a Turk, something like that. You know, I think a similar quote. But of course, that is sort of a regional pride, the Tabrizi pride, and I think this issue is also misunderstood with some people. Iran is a very mixed country. In fact, even when you say minority, we are all minorities. It's not clear who is actually majority. It's not clear. People like me who only speak Persian as a mother tongue, it's not clear that we are even a majority. So Iran has always been a mixed bag. And yeah, there is neglect and repression and discrimination for people of ethnic and religious minorities, particularly religious minorities. Yeah, so there's definitely demands on him to change that a little, but at the same time, he will also be wary of showing that he's the president of all Iranians, and not just the
Well,
Azerbaijan
I
region.
mean, he's a unique kind of guy, right? In that he has that ethnic background, and really radioactive ethnicities, Azeri and um,
Kurdish, yeah.
yeah, Kurdish, and the guy speaks English. He lost his wife, never remarried, which people think is really great. I'm sure
Yeah.
the women in particular think that, maybe not the men. And then he has this daughter who this is all from your articles, of course, nothing I knew about until I read your wonderful articles. He takes her everywhere, right? This daughter. So do we expect her to have some influence?
It's interesting, Masume Ebtekar, who is something like she's the epitome of the regime feminist, if you will, by which I mean she's an insider. She used to be the head of the environment organization. Of course, we would know her better. She was a spokesperson of Iranian students when they attacked the US embassy in
Right,
1979.
right.
But she's not a very well-liked figure because she's been there for a very long time, and she her husband was accused of corruption. She's not a very well-liked figure in many ways. And so she sort of did a tweet a few days ago that, oh, Pezeshkian's daughter should be like the first daughter. And this tweet got very negative reactions from all across the political spectrum in Iran, frankly. So I think the idea is that I think the reason, and it was kind of interesting for me, why is that wasn't because of her. It's not like anybody has any animus toward the Pezeshkian's daughter, but I think they're not fan of gimmicky things, like because Iran is in such a tough state of affairs, but they want actual policies. They want things that change people's lives. So I think they're gonna not. I don't think he's gonna do those sort of gimmicky things. And you mentioned some reasons he's sort of special in some ways. One thing else that I would say is that look, hate him or love him, and he's definitely done a lot of terrible things in his life, especially early on in 1979. Like many others, he did terrible things. He helped sort of segregate the universities, enforce. I mean, not sort of gender segregate, but he sort of enforced mandatory hijab. He's done a lot of terrible things in his life, but he's very much, if you listen to his speeches and if you listen to him, as I have for years now, and especially in the past few months, he's very much his own guy. He's a sort of somewhat a humble guy. It's really clear that he says what, he says what it is. He says it like what it is. And he said he was going to be loyal to the policy of Khamenei. He didn't give undue promises there, but he does look like someone who, who will pursue the stuff that matters to him and that he will try. Now, there's a scenario in which he miserably fails because he, maybe being such a honest little guy is not always useful in the sort of dog eats dog world of Iranian politics. So there is that, but I think people will remember that when they're looking at him. And I think he will be able to. I think, look, Iran has always constantly been in change. As I said, I think today it's doing worse than it was 20 years ago, than in most ways. But I think Iranians will continue to struggle to better their affairs. And I think that's not something that's going to change. And so that's why a lot of people can be a little hopeful about the immediate future.
Well, thank you so much, Arash. There's so much more I would have wanted to ask you, but my goodness, we've already run well over the allotted time. And thank you. And people should read your articles in The Atlantic. And there was a great profile of Pezeshkian in Al Majalla that I would also strongly advise the audience to look up. Keep up the great work, the great books, and speak to you soon, I hope.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye, Arash.
Bye-bye.
And this brings us to the end of this episode of On the Middle East. Thank you for tuning in, and don't forget to go to our website, www.al-monitor.com, for in-depth analysis on the Middle East.